The pressure outside is 16 times greater than the air you are breathing, a crushing force held back by a few inches of steel. Your body heat is being stripped away faster than your metabolism can replace it. The helium mixture you depend on conducting warmth from your core with ruthless efficiency. A sudden, violent jolt shatters the routine calm, and what follows is not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, calculated descent into darkness and cold when the single connection to the surface world is severed. On August 8, 1979, the diving support vessel MS Wildrake maintained station 130 miles off the coast of Scotland in the Thistle oil field. The North Sea churned grey and hostile above, but 520 feet below the surface, two men worked in near silence on the seabed. Richard Arthur Walker, 32 years old, and Victor Francis Guiel Jr., 28 years old and known universally as Skip, were commercial saturation divers performing routine pipeline maintenance. Their profession demanded a unique physiological adaptation. They had been living under pressure for days inside the ship's saturation chamber system. Their bodies slowly saturated with helium and oxygen at depths that would kill an ordinary diver within minutes. Saturation diving is not recreational exploration. It is industrial work conducted in an environment more hostile than the vacuum of space. The divers breathe a helium-oxygen mixture called heliox, which prevents nitrogen narcosis but transforms their voices into high-pitched distortions and strips body heat with terrifying efficiency. Helium conducts thermal energy 20 times faster than air, a property that makes even mild cold lethal without external heating. Walker and Guiel wore hot water suits connected to the diving bell by umbilical hoses, warm water circulating constantly to maintain core temperature against the near-freezing water temperature at depth. The bell itself was a pressurized steel sphere, approximately 6 feet in diameter, designed to transport divers from the saturation chamber to the work site while maintaining constant pressure. It hung suspended from the Wildrake by a primary lift wire, with a secondary umbilical bundle providing electrical power, communications, hot water supply, and emergency breathing gas. The system was state-of-the-art for its time, trusted by the offshore oil industry across the North Sea. Walker and Guiel had performed this descent dozens of times without incident. At 1600 hours local time, they were conducting final checks on a section of subsea pipeline when the primary lift wire failed. The steel cable, stressed beyond its rated capacity by years of cyclic loading and corrosion in the saltwater environment, parted with a sound like a rifle shot. The bell dropped approximately 15 feet before the umbilical cord arrested its fall, jerking the two men violently against the interior bulkheads. For 3 seconds, the umbilical held, then the sudden shock load exceeded its tensile strength, and the bundle tore apart. Absolute darkness claimed the interior of the bell as electrical power ceased. The background hum of the hot water pump, a sound so constant it had become subliminal, stopped. Walker and Guiel were now sealed inside a steel tomb at 520 feet, breathing a finite supply of gas, with no heat source and no communication with the surface. The water temperature outside the bell was 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, wearing suits no longer receiving warm water, their core temperatures would begin to drop within minutes. The immediate aftermath of the umbilical severance was profound silence. No radio static, no pump noise, no vibration from the lift winch above. The bell had become an isolated pressure vessel on the seabed, its only connection to the world above now severed. Walker and Guiel could hear each other breathing in the darkness, the helium distortion making even that familiar sound alien and thin. The bell retained its internal pressure, matching the 16 atmospheres of ambient seawater pressure at depth. This was critical. Any loss of pressure would have caused explosive decompression, forcing dissolved helium from their tissues in a cascade of arterial gas embolisms. The sphere's integrity held, but the systems that sustained life within it had failed. The emergency lighting did not activate. The carbon dioxide scrubber continued to function passively, but without power, there was no way to monitor its efficiency or remaining capacity. Walker, the senior diver, would have immediately assessed their situation with clinical precision. They had breathing gas for approximately 12 to 14 hours if they remained calm and controlled their metabolic rate. The bell's position on the seabed was known to the surface team, who would have registered the catastrophic loss of telemetry and power draw. A recovery operation would be mounted. The question was whether that operation could locate, hook, and retrieve the bell before hypothermia or gas depletion became fatal. The hot water suits, now unpowered, became thermal liabilities rather than protection. Residual water inside the suits began conducting heat away from their skin at an accelerated rate. Heliox, being breathed with every inhalation, stripped warmth from the respiratory tract and lungs. The physics of heat transfer in a helium environment are unforgiving. The human body generates approximately 100 watts of thermal energy at rest, but in a helium atmosphere at depth, heat loss can exceed 300 watts per hour. Within 30 minutes, both men would have begun shivering violently as their core temperatures dropped below 97 degrees Fahrenheit. They could not remove the suits. Exposure to the near-freezing heliox atmosphere inside the Bell without the neoprene barrier would accelerate hypothermia to lethal levels within an hour. Instead, they huddled together in the confined space, sharing body heat in the darkness. There was nothing else to do. No emergency beacon, no backup power, no manual override for the lift mechanism that might have allowed them to trigger a buoyant ascent. The Bell was designed to be recovered, not to self-rescue. The only tool they possessed for communication was a slate and grease pencil used routinely for underwater notes. In the absolute blackness, writing would have been impossible, but Walker, or Guiel, the forensic record does not specify which wrote messages to the surface in the desperate hope that when the Bell was eventually recovered, someone would understand what had happened in those final hours. Hypothermia is not a sudden cessation of life. It is a systemic shutdown, a progressive failure of metabolic and neurological function as core temperature falls below the narrow range required for cellular processes. At 95 degrees Fahrenheit, mild hypothermia begins. Shivering intensifies, becoming violent and uncontrollable as the body attempts to generate heat through muscle activity. Cognitive function remains largely intact, but fine motor control deteriorates. At 92 degrees Fahrenheit, moderate hypothermia sets in. Shivering paradoxically ceases as the body exhausts its glycogen reserves. Confusion and disorientation take hold. The victim may begin to undress, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, as peripheral vasoconstriction causes a false sensation of warmth. Speech becomes slurred. Coordination fails. In a helium environment, this stage arrives 3 to 4 times faster than in air. Below 86 degrees Fahrenheit, severe hypothermia is established. The heart begins to fibrillate irregularly. Consciousness fades. Metabolic rate drops to a fraction of normal, conserving the diminishing oxygen supply in the blood. Respiration becomes shallow and sporadic. The victim enters a state that resembles hibernation, though without the physiological adaptations that make true hibernation survivable. Death from cardiac arrest typically occurs between 77 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Walker and Guiel, sealed inside the Bell, experienced this descent together. The heliox atmosphere accelerated every stage. Within 2 hours, cognitive function would have been severely impaired. By 6 hours, both men would have been semi-conscious at best. Their bodies locked in a futile struggle to maintain core temperature against an environment designed to strip heat without mercy. They huddled together, sharing the last remnants of warmth. This is not speculation. It is confirmed by the position in which their bodies were discovered. Human beings, even in extremis, seek contact with others. It is a reflexive response to existential isolation, a neurological imperative that persists until the final loss of consciousness. The forensic evidence suggests they remained in physical contact until the end. The duration of their ordeal can be estimated with reasonable precision. The Bell was lost at 1600 hours. Recovery efforts on the surface began immediately, but locating a small, unpowered object on the seabed at 520 feet in the North Sea required sonar sweeps and remotely operated vehicle confirmation. The process consumed hours. When the Bell was finally hooked and brought to the surface the following morning, both men had been exposed to the lethal environment for approximately 14 to 19 hours. Hypothermia would have claimed them long before gas depletion became a factor. Aboard the MS Wildrake, the catastrophic loss of the diving bell triggered immediate emergency protocols. The duty officer registered the simultaneous failure of electrical telemetry, voice communication, and hot water circulation at 1600 hours. Within seconds, the ship's dynamic positioning system was locked to hold station directly above the last known coordinates of the Bell. The dive superintendent initiated a lost Bell recovery procedure, a scenario that every saturation diving crew trains for but hopes never to execute. The first challenge was confirmation of the Bell's position. At 520 feet, visual confirmation was impossible without deploying another dive team or a remotely operated vehicle. Sonar sweeps began immediately, mapping the seabed in expanding circles around the presumed location. The North Sea at this depth is not a flat plain, but a landscape of ridges, depressions, and scattered debris from decades of industrial activity. Distinguishing a 6-foot steel sphere from natural features or pipeline infrastructure required methodical analysis. By 1800 hours, sonar had identified a probable target. A remotely operated vehicle was deployed to verify the contact. The ROV reached the seabed at 1930 hours, its cameras confirming the diving bell resting upright on the sediment, umbilical cords severed and trailing uselessly in the current. The bell showed no external damage, no lights were visible inside. There was no response to acoustic signaling. The recovery operation required attaching a new lift wire to the bell's lifting eyes while maintaining precise positioning of the Wildrake in deteriorating sea conditions. The North Sea does not grant respite for emergencies. Swells built throughout the evening, complicating the already delicate task of maneuvering a hook onto a small target 520 feet below the surface. The first attempt failed when the lifting hook slipped free during tensioning. A second attempt at 2200 hours succeeded in securing the line. Bringing the bell to the surface required 19 hours of controlled ascent to prevent rapid decompression of the interior atmosphere. If the bell's pressure equalization valve had been damaged or compromised, a too rapid ascent could have caused explosive decompression, destroying any evidence and ensuring no possibility of survival. The crew aboard the Wildrake had no way of knowing whether Walker and Guiel were alive, unconscious, or already dead. Protocol demanded they assume survival was possible and execute the recovery as though every minute mattered. At 0600 hours on August 9th, the bell broke the surface. It was mated to the deck saturation chamber, and pressure was equalized between the two systems. Dr. Morven White, a physician who had been placed into saturation specifically for this contingency, entered the bell through the transfer tunnel to make the official assessment. The formality was necessary. Only a medical professional under pressure could legally confirm death in a saturation environment, without risking further casualties by decompressing the bodies prematurely. Dr. White's report was clinical and final. Both Richard Arthur Walker and Victor Francis Guiel Jr. were deceased. Core body temperatures, measured rectally, were consistent with prolonged severe hypothermia. There were no signs of trauma, drowning, or carbon dioxide poisoning. The cause of death was systemic failure secondary to extreme cold. The bell was left sealed and pressurized until after full medical and forensic documentation could be conducted under controlled conditions. Walker and Guiel's bodies remained inside for an additional 36 hours while a decompression schedule was calculated to safely bring them to surface, pressure without causing tissue damage that would complicate the post-mortem examination. This was not a mark of disrespect but a procedural necessity. Decompressing human remains too quickly can cause gas emboli in tissues, obscuring the true cause of death. On August 11th, the bell was finally decompressed to atmospheric pressure and opened. Forensic pathologists from Scotland entered to conduct the in-situ examination before the bodies were removed. Walker and Guiel were found huddled together in the lower section of the bell, their limbs intertwined, both men wearing their hot water suits. The slate with handwritten messages was recovered and photographed, though the specific content has never been publicly released, out of respect for the families. Autopsies were performed at a facility in Aberdeen. The official cause of death for both men was severe hypothermia, with core temperatures at the time of discovery estimated to have been below 75 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no water in the lungs, ruling out drowning. Carbon dioxide levels in the bell's atmosphere, though elevated, were within survivable limits, confirming that gas toxicity had not been the primary lethal factor. The men had frozen to death in the darkness, fully conscious of their fate for at least the first several hours of their ordeal. The physical evidence from the bell told a clear story. The umbilical severance had been catastrophic and complete. All 7 hoses in the bundle had parted simultaneously under the shock load when the lift wire failed. The emergency battery system designed to provide backup lighting had corroded and failed to activate. The manual buoyancy release, which in theory could have allowed the bell to ascend on its own, was found to be mechanically seized and inoperable. The bell had been a death trap with redundant systems that existed only on paper. The forensic analysis extended to the wreckage of the lift wire and umbilical bundle, recovered from the seabed in the weeks following the accident. Metallurgical examination revealed advanced fatigue cracking in the primary lift cable, consistent with cyclic loading beyond the wire's rated duty cycle. The umbilical bundle showed evidence of abrasion damage at multiple points where it had rubbed against the bell's support framework during routine operations. Both failures were preventable, with proper inspection and maintenance protocols. The conclusion was inescapable. The MS Wildrake had been operating with inadequate safety margins, worn equipment, and no functional backup systems. Walker and Guiel had been sent to the seabed in a bell that could not self-rescue and depended entirely on a single lift wire and umbilical for survival. When both failed simultaneously, death was not a possibility, but a certainty. The UK Department of Energy convened a fatal accident inquiry in Scotland from May 11th to May 21st, 1981. The inquiry heard testimony from the crew of the MS Wildrake, engineers from the bell manufacturer, representatives from the oil company responsible for the Thistle field operations, and independent diving safety experts. The findings were damning. The vessel had been operating with lift wires that exceeded their recommended replacement interval by 40%. The umbilical bundle had no secondary strain relief. The emergency systems in the bell had not been tested in over 6 months. The inquiry issued a series of mandatory recommendations that became the foundation for modern commercial diving safety regulations. All saturation diving vessels were required to install secondary lift wires with independent attachment points. Umbilical bundles were required to have armored strain relief and redundant power supplies. Diving bells were mandated to carry independent emergency lighting, buoyancy release systems, and acoustic beacons. The recommendations were not suggestions. They became enforceable law across the North Sea oil industry within 18 months. But legal reform does not resurrect the dead. The families of Richard Walker and Victor Guiel initiated civil litigation against the oil company responsible for the MS Wildrake's operations, seeking accountability for the deaths. The case dragged through the courts for 8 years, a prolonged struggle against corporate legal teams with resources far exceeding those of the grieving relatives. In 1987, the company finally admitted wrongdoing and settled the case, though the specific terms were sealed under confidentiality agreements. The accident became a case study in failure analysis at maritime engineering institutions worldwide. The book Into the Lion's Mouth by Michel Smart, published in 2014, provided a detailed reconstruction of the event and the subsequent legal battle, drawing on court records, interviews with survivors of the rescue operation, and archival documents from the inquiry. The title references the diverse own terminology for entering the bell stepping into the lions, trusting the machinery to bring them back alive. Walker and Guiel are memorialized in the commercial diving community as examples of men who died not from their own errors, but from systemic failures imposed upon them by an industry that prioritized cost efficiency over human life. Their names appear on the memorial wall at the International Divers Hall of Fame, alongside hundreds of others who have been lost to the depths. The slate they wrote on in the darkness has never been publicly displayed, but its existence serves as a stark reminder that they knew, in those final hours, that help would not arrive in time. Subscribe to Forensic Protocol to understand how industrial disasters reshape the regulations meant to prevent them, and why those regulations are so often written in blood.